Walter Green had been a fixture in the small cul-de-sac for decades. At 73, he had lived a life measured by routine, the rhythm of days marked by the simple pleasures of retirement. Every morning, like clockwork, he would step out onto his weathered front porch, just as the first slivers of sunlight cut through the trees, leaning on his cane, surveying the quiet street with a practiced, almost protective gaze. Neighbors came to know him as a man of meticulous habits, mail picked up at exactly 9, the garden watered promptly, and the small wooden bench on the porch polished every Sunday. To anyone watching from the outside, Walter Green's life seemed as orderly and predictable as the sunrise itself. Yet, on that crisp October morning in 2019, the rhythm faltered, and it began in the most subtle, unassuming way. At first, it was the absence of the familiar sight, the empty porch, the missing silhouette against the early light. Neighbors, busy with their own routines, noticed but assumed he had slept in or was visiting a nearby friend. By the second day, unease began to take root. The mail lay undisturbed, newspapers stacked neatly on the walkway untouched. Mrs. Keller, who lived across the street and had often shared morning coffee with Walter on chilly weekends, felt a growing knot of worry. She knocked gently on the front door, calling his name, but only the hollow echo of silence answered her. By the third day, the quiet cul-de-sac, once a sanctuary of familiar greetings and polite nods, began to feel wrong, uncanny even. Neighbors exchanged uncertain glances over hedges, hesitant to intrude, yet alarmed enough to discuss what might have happened. The family, summoned in a wave of mounting concern, arrived to a scene that was as unremarkable as it was alarming. Walter's front door was locked, as it always had been. Inside, the home bore the subtle signs of ordinary life, a half-full cup of tea on the counter, the television still humming from the night before, but nothing indicated a sudden departure, no struggle, no disarray. Personal items lay where he had left them, his wallet, keys, and reading glasses untouched. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The initial shock rippled outward, leaving Susan Green, his daughter, frantically trying to piece together a puzzle that seemed to have no edges. She retraced phone calls, emails, and last visits, grasping at any detail that might suggest what had occurred, but there were only fragments, shadows of a life that seemed to have ended abruptly. Police were called, and an investigation began, methodical and thorough, yet frustratingly inconclusive. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, asking questions and reviewing surveillance footage from nearby homes, but they found little beyond the ordinary. A single camera captured Walter stepping outside on the morning he disappeared, leaning briefly on his cane as he surveyed the street. But then nothing. There were no signs of anyone following him, no vehicles lingering suspiciously. Forensic teams combed the house for overlooked clues, collecting fingerprints, documenting the arrangement of objects, and testing for any trace of foul play. Yet, all results pointed to normalcy. The home itself became a silent witness to the mystery, its ordered spaces amplifying the absence that hung over it. As days turned into weeks, the neighborhood began to absorb the tension in quiet, private ways. Children playing near the park were occasionally hushed by adults who whispered about Walter Green, the man who vanished. Conversations at grocery stores and local diners carried a weight of unspoken fear. What if this could happen to someone else, to someone they loved? Even among friends and extended family, grief mixed with a sense of bewilderment, a persistent gnawing need for answers that refused to be satisfied. The local police, though diligent, began to acknowledge the frustrating reality that many disappearances leave no immediate trace, and the case quietly slipped into a state of unresolved limbo, the sort of limbo that breeds obsessive thought, small superstitions, and endless what-ifs. Yet, despite the confusion and the silence, the sense of Walter Green's presence lingered in the cul-de-sac. His garden, still well-tended, and his polished porch, unclaimed by decay, became quiet memorials to a life suddenly absent. Neighbors who had once waved from driveways now paused in the street, glancing toward the empty porch with a mixture of concern and disbelief. Susan Green, unable to accept the emptiness, kept vigil in her own way, visiting the house daily, touching the railing he had polished, running her fingers across the familiar grooves in the wood, searching for a sign, any trace that could explain the unexplainable. And in those silent moments, in the shadow of ordinary life interrupted, the true weight of the disappearance settled over the community, a haunting certainty that something profound, something entirely unknowable, had occurred on that crisp autumn morning. Detectives arrived at Walter Green's home with the kind of methodical focus reserved for cases that offered few leads but demanded thoroughness. They moved systematically, photographing the interior, noting the placement of objects, and cataloging personal items that seemed frozen in time. Outside, neighbors were questioned repeatedly, each retelling of mundane observations tinged with anxiety. One man recalled seeing Walter shuffle toward the mailbox a few days before the disappearance, seemingly in no rush, as if he had an appointment with nothing at all. Another neighbor mentioned a delivery driver who had seen him step onto the porch that final morning, but even the driver could offer no insight beyond Walter's usual measured routine. Every account seemed inconsequential, yet collectively they created a tapestry of normalcy that made his absence all the more unsettling. Police reviewed local CCTV footage, scanning hours of grainy recordings for any anomaly. Walter was captured stepping onto the porch, adjusting his cardigan, glancing up the street as though expecting someone. He lingered briefly, taking in the crisp autumn air before retreating behind the front door. There was no sign of anyone following him, no vehicle idling suspiciously nearby, no sudden movement that could explain what happened next. For the investigators, this absence of evidence was maddening. Each frame confirmed only what they already knew. Walter Green had vanished, leaving behind the world he had always inhabited, and the reason remained a mystery. Officers pored over the hours leading up to his disappearance, cross-referencing mundane activities like newspaper delivery times, neighborhood dog walks, and routine mail pickups, searching for a thread they could pull, but each detail ended in the same frustrating emptiness. As days stretched into a week, rumors began to swirl through the quiet streets. Some neighbors whispered of accidents, perhaps a fall in the yard, or a medical emergency that had incapacitated him long enough for him to leave unnoticed. Others spoke in hushed tones of foul play, imagining a shadowy figure who had taken advantage of his age and solitude. The variety of speculation mirrored the helplessness of those closest to him, especially his daughter Susan, whose concern was compounded by an inability to reconcile the image of her father as safe and careful with the stark reality of his disappearance. She retraced her steps in her mind, replaying the last conversation she had with him, analyzing his tone, his expressions, looking for the smallest hint of distress she might have missed. Every ordinary moment became suspicious, every detail potentially significant. The human mind, she realized, could obsess over the tiniest inconsequential cues when faced with the inexplicable. The family's frustration grew as the case seemed to stall. Susan spent long hours in Walter's empty house, examining the furniture arrangement, lingering over the spots where he usually placed his things. She noticed details that might otherwise go unnoticed: a pen left uncapped on the desk, a half-filled teacup on the counter, the way the morning light fell differently across the porch than it had the day before. Each observation was catalogued, mentally or in a notebook she carried with her, as if meticulous record-keeping could uncover what the police could not. Yet, despite her efforts, no pattern emerged. Her meticulousness was a desperate attempt to make sense of the senseless, to impose order on a world that had suddenly become chaotic. Sleep became irregular, meals forgotten, and even familiar streets felt alien without her father's presence anchoring them in memory. Detectives returned again and again, their presence a reminder of both hope and futility. They interviewed mail carriers, delivery personnel, and distant relatives, all producing little more than ordinary recollections of Walter's routines. Friends described him as quiet, meticulous, and private, traits that, while endearing in life, complicated the search in absence. There were no altercations, no known conflicts, no recent changes in health beyond the natural signs of aging. Every avenue investigated seemed to lead to another dead end, each unremarkable fact reinforcing the mystery. The officer's language grew cautious over time. Phrases like unexplained disappearance replaced the more optimistic, "we'll find him." The case began to feel like a shadow cast over the neighborhood, an absence that was tangible, pressing, and entirely without explanation. The psychological toll on Susan was profound. She began to experience moments of doubt and despair, obsessing over details that seemed meaningless to anyone else. She measured the timing of Walter's routine visits to the porch, considered the positioning of objects in his home, and lingered over minor inconsistencies in neighbor recollections, hoping to detect a clue. The memory of their last interaction haunted her, the fleeting wave from the porch, the brief nod, the casual mention of picking up the mail later in the morning. Each thought replayed endlessly, her mind twisting ordinary gestures into potential signals of trouble. Sleep eluded her, replaced by nights of pacing, phone calls to neighbors at odd hours, and meticulous scrutiny of anything connected to her father's life. As the initial flurry of investigation waned, the case began to grow cold. Leads evaporated, and the normal rhythms of police work reasserted themselves in other, more solvable cases. Yet for Susan, and for those closest to Walter, the silence remained deafening. The neighborhood, once alive with the subtle warmth of morning routines, felt hollow. Every door, every window seemed to echo his absence. Friends and family spoke in tentative tones, careful not to upset the fragile balance of hope and grief, but beneath it all, a persistent unease simmered. Walter Green had disappeared into nothingness, leaving behind a void filled only with questions, speculation, and the relentless ache of not knowing. Even as days turned into weeks, the story remained unresolved. Neighbors revisited their own observations, trying to reconcile the ordinary with the extraordinary, the mundane with the impossible. And through it all, Susan clung to the hope that something, anything, would provide a sign of her father, a thread to pull in the labyrinth of his absence. But for now, the investigation, painstaking and thorough, revealed only what everyone feared most: that Walter Green had vanished entirely, leaving behind a community gripped by uncertainty, a family consumed by worry, and a mystery that refused to yield. Months passed after Walter Green's disappearance, and the initial wave of urgency that had swept through the neighborhood gradually gave way to a quieter, lingering tension. For many, life attempted to resume its ordinary rhythm, but for those closest to him, particularly his daughter Susan, the absence remained a persistent ache, a void that could not be reconciled. It was during these quieter months that subtle, almost imperceptible clues began to surface. Small anomalies that suggested perhaps Walter's disappearance was not as straightforward as it had first appeared. At first, these hints were easily dismissed as the products of grief, overactive imaginations, or the mind's desperate attempt to make sense of an inexplicable event. But gradually, a pattern of irregularities began to take shape, and with it, a new layer of unease emerged. One neighbor, Mr. Harlan, mentioned in passing that he had seen a figure lingering near Walter's home several weeks before the man vanished. It was the sort of observation that, in retrospect, seemed loaded with significance but had gone unnoticed at the time. The figure was described as tall and indistinct, always keeping to the edges of the property, never approaching directly. Harlan had assumed it was a passing stranger, someone exercising a dog, or perhaps a surveyor checking the neighborhood, yet the detail gnawed at him as the months wore on. When Susan heard this, she immediately pressed for more information, trying to visualize the figure, to attach a face to the memory. Even the faintest detail, the coat's color, the direction of movement, the time of day, was scrutinized, cataloged, and mentally cross-referenced against the days surrounding her father's disappearance. Every recollection, no matter how trivial, became a potential clue, a fragment of a puzzle that refused to reveal itself. At the same time, investigators made a discovery inside Walter's home that had initially been overlooked. A small journal, its cover worn and its pages filled with sketches that seemed innocuous at first glance. On closer examination, the drawings revealed a curious focus on porches, trees, and faintly outlined human shapes. Some sketches depicted Walter himself, seated or standing in familiar positions, yet other forms were less distinct. Figures that hovered at the edges of the page, almost as if they existed in the periphery of his perception. Forensic analysts and detectives debated their significance. Were these simply the whimsical doodles of a retired carpenter with too much idle time, or did they represent something more deliberate, a subtle record of fear, caution, or premonition? Each line, each shadowed silhouette, was examined with painstaking care. Yet no definitive interpretation could be drawn. Susan became increasingly absorbed by the journal, treating it as a potential roadmap to understanding her father's state of mind. She would sit for hours, tracing the inked lines, noting the angles of the porches, the direction of trees, and the placement of human forms, seeking meaning where none had been apparent before. Every drawing was dissected, cross-referenced with dates, weather patterns, and neighborhood activity. The psychological weight of this obsessive study began to manifest physically: sleepless nights, skipped meals, and a persistent tension that tightened her chest whenever she considered the possibility that her father had sensed something, a presence, a threat that none of them had recognized. Friends and family gently urged her to step back, but Susan felt an almost magnetic pull, a need to honor her father's perception, however cryptic it appeared on the page. Detectives, though skeptical, incorporated the sketches into their ongoing investigation. They photographed each page, enhancing lines and shadowed forms to determine whether they could uncover hidden details. Specialists in criminal behavior were consulted, asked to assess whether the depictions suggested a rational fear, paranoia, or perhaps evidence of an external observer influencing Walter's daily life. Theories proliferated. Some suggested a stranger was watching the house, someone who may have become emboldened over time. Others argued Walter had invented the figures as a coping mechanism, a way to externalize vague anxieties. For all the professional analysis, however, there remained a sense of ambiguity, a tension between logical explanation and the intangible feeling that the sketches were a silent record of something beyond immediate comprehension. As these mysterious hints accumulated, the neighborhood itself seemed to change under the weight of speculation. Residents began to notice things they had previously ignored: the way shadows lingered longer near Walter's porch, the timing of passerby footsteps, even the quiet rustling of leaves that seemed almost deliberate. Each observation, when paired with the sketches and the recollection of the unknown figure, formed a lattice of subtle unease. Conversations in the community shifted from casual gossip to hushed speculation. The story of Walter Green's disappearance took on a quality of obsessive scrutiny, where ordinary details were imbued with extraordinary significance. Amid this atmosphere, Susan's obsession deepened. She would revisit her father's porch at twilight, imagining how he might have perceived the surroundings, attempting to detect patterns or signals that eluded others. The journal became a constant companion, a fragile tether connecting her to the man who had vanished so abruptly, offering cryptic guidance and unanswered questions in equal measure. The tension mounted as the lines between ordinary life and the mysterious grew thinner, each anomaly magnified by the absence of resolution. The community watched silently, drawn into a slow, collective acknowledgement that something had been present, unseen, shaping events from beyond immediate perception, yet remaining entirely intangible. By the time the third month arrived, the sense of an unseen presence had woven itself into the fabric of the investigation and the family's daily life. The sketches, the neighbor's account, and the cumulative weight of minor inconsistencies created an unresolved pressure, a psychological knot that refused to be untied. Investigators and family members alike were confronted with the realization that Walter Green's disappearance might involve elements beyond standard explanation. The story teetered on the edge of understanding, a careful balancing act between fact, fear, and conjecture, leaving everyone involved suspended in a state of anticipation. The narrative held its breath, poised to tip toward revelation, yet stubbornly suspended, reflecting the tenuous boundary between what is known and what remains hidden. As news of Walter Green's disappearance circulated beyond the quiet cul-de-sac, it attracted a modest degree of media attention, enough to momentarily shine a spotlight on the family's anguish. Local news outlets ran brief segments highlighting the mystery. A retired carpenter vanishes without a trace. Neighbors and family left to grapple with unanswered questions. Flyers appeared on lampposts, community boards, and grocery store windows, each bearing Walter's photograph, his warm, lined face smiling from a life interrupted. In the days following, a small cluster of neighbors and concerned strangers gathered on the street where Walter had lived, holding candles and murmuring words of hope for his safe return. Yet the media cycle proved mercurial. Headlines quickly shifted to other stories, other crises, leaving the Green family suspended in a silence heavier than before. Susan felt the ebbing of public attention like a physical weight pressing on her chest, the fading interest in her father's fate amplifying her sense of isolation. The neighborhood itself responded in its own quiet, earnest ways. Those who had shared casual morning greetings with Walter now moved cautiously, the familiar routines of daily life overlaid with a tentative vigilance. Friends checked on one another, and small groups convened to discuss what had happened, their conversations weaving between sorrow, speculation, and self-reassurance. The vigils offered a fragile comfort, yet they were also reminders of absence. Walter's empty porch, the undisturbed rake in the yard, the chair that remained unoccupied. Each reminder of his absence became an emblem of loss, amplifying the feeling that life had shifted imperceptibly, yet irreversibly, in his absence. In the midst of this quiet upheaval, the police took the opportunity to reopen certain lines of inquiry. Detectives revisited earlier interviews, pressing neighbors for details they might have overlooked the first time. It was during one of these renewed discussions that a fleeting but intriguing lead emerged. A neighbor recalled Walter speaking about a painter who had recently moved into town, a man whose reputation was characterized by subtle, enigmatic works. According to the neighbor, Walter had mentioned being both fascinated and unsettled by the artist's style, noting the recurrent presence of human figures that seemed to linger at the edges of the canvas. While the recollection did not directly connect the painter to Walter's disappearance, it introduced a subtle layer of uncertainty, a potential misdirection that hinted at a connection between art, observation, and an unseen narrative, leaving investigators and family members alike wondering whether the painter had simply been an object of casual conversation or a figure of greater significance. Susan absorbed this information with the intensity of someone clutching a lifeline. The idea of a painter, someone who might observe, interpret, or even capture elements of reality that others missed, resonated with her growing suspicion that Walter had been aware of, or even wary of, a presence that lingered on the margins. She combed through the details of her father's remarks, trying to remember the cadence of his words, the context in which he had mentioned the artist, and whether there had been an undercurrent of concern, humor, or apprehension. For Susan, the lead was a faint glimmer of possibility, a tentative bridge between her father's life before he vanished and the mysterious absence that followed. Meanwhile, law enforcement approached the lead with cautious pragmatism. Detectives conducted background checks, reviewed publicly available information on the painter, and sought to determine whether there had been any interactions with Walter that might have escalated into a tangible threat. The process was meticulous, yet inherently inconclusive. No record suggested any direct contact beyond casual encounters in the neighborhood, and nothing in the painter's history implied criminal intent. Nonetheless, the lead served its purpose in the narrative of the investigation. It introduced ambiguity, a thread that suggested there was more to Walter's disappearance than simple misfortune or random accident. It reminded everyone involved that a multitude of small, overlooked details could accumulate to form the outlines of a larger, hidden picture. As public attention waned, the Green family remained in a state of heightened vigilance. Susan, her mother, and Walter's siblings maintained daily routines that revolved around monitoring any potential developments, speaking with law enforcement, and cataloging even the smallest anomalies in neighborhood activity. The contrast between the brief flare of public concern and the persistent, quiet reality of their grief became a source of frustration and loneliness. Community support, once energized by candlelight vigils and sympathetic media coverage, dissolved into scattered goodwill and polite inquiries, leaving the family to navigate the uncertainty largely on their own. This isolation compounded the emotional toll, intensifying the sense that Walter's disappearance existed in a separate dimension of reality, simultaneously present and absent, tangible and elusive. The psychological impact of this dynamic was significant. For Susan, the fading attention magnified the urgency of her internal investigation, the obsessive focus on her father's habits, his journals, and his remarks. Each day, without resolution, deepened the fissure between normal life and the distorted perception of danger and loss she carried with her. For the detectives, the tenuous lead involving the painter became a reminder that even apparently peripheral details might contain significance, and that the investigation's success depended on careful attention to the minutiae that others might dismiss as inconsequential. The neighborhood, meanwhile, settled into a quiet unease, the rhythm of life continuing while the absence of one of its longtime residents lingered like a shadow on familiar streets. By the time the community's brief engagement had fully ebbed, the narrative of Walter Green's disappearance had taken on an enduring quality, one defined by lingering questions, subtle misdirections, and the quiet endurance of those left behind. The painter, the journal sketches, the unseen observer, and the fleeting impressions of neighbors coalesced into a mosaic of uncertainty, maintaining suspense without providing clarity. In this landscape of partial truths and whispered suspicions, the story held its momentum, poised for the next turn in the investigation, where emotional investment, forensic diligence, and the unrelenting quest for answers would intersect once again. The unresolved tension set the stage for revelations yet to come, preserving a careful balance between grief, hope, and the creeping, persistent sense that something extraordinary had occurred just beyond the edges of perception. 4 years passed with a quiet, oppressive weight settling over the Green family. Time, which often heals, seemed instead to crystallize their grief, freezing each day into a recurring loop of unanswered questions. Susan's life became defined by the absence of her father, each morning marked by the ritual of scanning for any sign, any anomaly that might hint at Walter's whereabouts. She returned endlessly to his journals, tracing the cryptic sketches over and over, as if familiarity with the lines and shapes might reveal a hidden code or message he had left for her. Porches, trees, shadowy figures. What had once seemed like idle doodles gradually assumed an almost obsessive significance. Every detail in the house, from the placement of the furniture to the slight wear on the front step, became a potential clue, a fragment of a puzzle that refused to coalesce into a coherent picture. Nights were the hardest. Susan would lie awake listening for sounds that could only exist in memory: the creak of Walter's favorite rocking chair, the shuffle of his boots on the porch, the soft murmur of his voice humming an old tune. In the silence, grief and anticipation intertwined, a gnawing tension that left her physically exhausted, yet emotionally incapable of stepping away. Meanwhile, the town moved forward in ways that underscored Walter's absence. The cul-de-sac that had once thrummed with quiet familiarity now felt like a tableau frozen in time. Leaves fell and were cleared, lawns were mowed and abandoned, and houses once occupied by longtime neighbors changed hands. Walter's home, however, remained untouched in many ways, its exterior slowly succumbing to weather and neglect. Paint peeled from the siding, the porch sagged slightly at one corner, and the garden he had tended with such care grew wild and unruly. Yet the physical deterioration mirrored a subtler social shift, the normalization of absence. Neighbors who had once called with concern now nodded politely from a distance, their interest diffused by the passage of time and the multiplicity of life's demands. The disappearance, once a topic of local speculation and minor media coverage, had become a footnote, a quiet story the town acknowledged but no longer actively pursued. The official designation of the case as unresolved added a bureaucratic layer to the emotional toll, codifying the uncertainty into an institutional acceptance that Walter might never return. Within this framework of waiting, the psychological impact on Susan and her family deepened. The human mind, when starved of closure, begins to invent scenarios and possibilities to fill the void. Susan found herself meticulously examining every mundane occurrence for hidden significance: a shadow that passed her window, a fleeting figure across the street, the placement of a garden ornament that seemed to echo shapes from her father's sketches. Her mother, too, lived in a constant state of subdued vigilance, every knock at the door or unexpected call setting off a surge of anxiety that left her both exhausted and brittle. The siblings oscillated between periods of reluctant acceptance and intense bouts of searching for answers, their emotional states mirroring the oscillation between hope and despair that characterized every day of these 4 years. Within the family, conversations about Walter became the anchor for connection, even as the repetition of speculation and memory frayed nerves and heightened tension. Silence, once a neutral backdrop, had transformed into a palpable presence, heavy and relentless, pressing against every interaction, coloring every gesture with an undercurrent of unresolved fear. The strain extended beyond the household. The small community that had once rallied with vigils and interest gradually settled into a distant observance. Children who had played near Walter's porch had grown into teenagers. Neighbors who had once gathered to exchange observations and condolences now conducted daily life with polite acknowledgement of a story that no longer demanded their attention. The juxtaposition of familial obsession and community normalization created an isolating duality. Inside the green home, the world was constantly watched and scrutinized for signs of Walter, while outside, life flowed onward with an indifferent momentum. This duality accentuated the sense of alienation for Susan, who found herself walking the thin line between persistence and obsession, each day blurring the boundary between protective diligence and compulsive behavior. Emotional reality and investigative instinct had merged, feeding a cycle of hyper-awareness that was both exhausting and necessary for maintaining a connection to her father. Amid this long period of stasis, the psychological tension was punctuated by small, often unremarkable events that nonetheless took on amplified significance. The faint scent of cedar from the porch, a misplaced tool in the garden, the occasional reflection of light in the window, all became potential signals from a father who might still exist somewhere, waiting to be rediscovered. Each discovery, no matter how trivial, rekindled hope and renewed the intensity of her search, fueling the notion that Walter's absence was not absolute, that some trace of him persisted in the everyday world, waiting to be noticed by the vigilant eye. For Susan, these moments of heightened attention were both balm and burden, offering temporary reassurance, while simultaneously reminding her of the vast, unbridgeable gap created by 4 years of silence. By the 4th year, the cumulative effect of these factors, familial vigilance, social normalization, and emotional exhaustion, had created a narrative tension that was almost palpable. The story of Walter Green had become more than a missing person case. It was an ongoing psychological landscape, a study in the endurance of hope amid uncertainty and the corrosive effect of unresolved absence. Every minor observation, every remembered conversation, every symbolic echo of his presence became a potential pivot point, a delicate thread that could lead to discovery, revelation, or despair. The stage was now set for a subtle shift, a disruption in the pattern that would challenge assumptions, bring renewed scrutiny, and ultimately steer the story toward the extraordinary revelation that had so far remained just beyond the horizon. The psychological landscape, painstakingly crafted by years of waiting and meticulous attention to absence, primed the family and community alike for the next turning point, one that would alter the understanding of Walter Green's disappearance forever. It was a crisp November afternoon in 2023 when Susan found herself wandering through the local art gallery, a place she had visited occasionally over the years but never with any particular urgency. The walls were lined with new works, abstract landscapes, experimental portraits, and familiar local names, but it was one piece that stopped her cold, halting her steps as if the air itself had thickened around her. Positioned near the center of the gallery, it depicted a man sitting on a porch beneath a sprawling oak tree, rendered in meticulous detail. The composition was ordinary enough at first glance, a serene domestic scene, but as Susan's eyes lingered, her recognition became undeniable. Every nuance, the slope of the shoulders, the relaxed bend of the knees, the slight tilt of the head, matched Walter Green. It was him. She felt the ground shift beneath her, a sudden vertigo of disbelief and shock. Her heart accelerated, and for a moment she could not breathe, could not reconcile the familiarity of the figure with the 4 years of absence that had defined her life. The brushstrokes seemed impossibly precise, capturing not just a likeness but a presence, a weight of being that made the impossible feel tangible. Susan pressed closer, her hand unconsciously rising to her mouth as she whispered his name to herself, a quiet invocation that drew the attention of a gallery attendant nearby. The staff were patient, but puzzled by her reaction. They assured her that the painting was new, that it had not been on display the previous week, and that no record existed of the artist leaving a name or signature. Susan absorbed this information in fragments, her mind oscillating between skepticism and an instinctive, almost desperate belief that the painting was a message, a bridge between the absence that had dominated her life and a present she could scarcely accept. How could Walter appear in such intimate detail without any known explanation? Questions collided in her mind. Had he returned to town in secret? Had someone captured his likeness in the intervening years? Or was this some extraordinary, unexplainable phenomenon, a form of communication that defied reason? Every logical pathway she attempted to follow dissolved into uncertainty, leaving her suspended in the tension between hope and incredulity. The gallery, which had once felt like a neutral space of observation and reflection, became charged with an electric, almost sacred energy, each detail of the painting amplified by the context of her longing. Susan's eyes traced the familiar elements of the scene, cataloging them with obsessive precision. The oak tree's gnarled branches extended exactly as they did in her father's yard, its shadow casting a shape she recognized instinctively. The porch matched the subtle angle of the railing in Walter's home, the paint chipped in the same irregular pattern. Even the position of a single chair, slightly askew, mirrored an arrangement she had known intimately for decades. She could feel the faint imprint of memory overlaid onto the brushstrokes, each stroke resonating with emotional accuracy that no stranger could have conceived without first-hand knowledge. The uncanny realism of the piece was disorienting, threading the familiar and the impossible into a single image that seemed to pulse with latent meaning. Susan stepped back and forward, scrutinizing the painting from every angle, searching for any signature, any clue that could hint at the artist or the circumstances under which it had been created. The absence of any identifying mark only deepened the mystery, intensifying the sense that Walter, in some unfathomable way, had left this trace himself. The gallery staff, though polite and professional, could offer no further explanation. They speculated that it might be a local artist experimenting with realism, or that the piece had been submitted anonymously. Yet their words sounded hollow against the stark specificity of Susan's experience. This was not a generic figure, not a composite or imagined character. It was Walter, alive in pigment and canvas, occupying a space that should have been empty. As she stood there, the years of waiting, the obsessive study of journals, sketches, and details, the endless nights of scanning and searching, all converged into a single, piercing moment of emotional upheaval. Susan felt a mix of exhilaration and terror, a visceral awareness that her father's absence had somehow intersected with the world in a manner that transcended ordinary understanding. The painting was more than art, it was evidence, a touchpoint that made the abstract ache of loss suddenly tangible and urgent. Beyond the immediate shock, Susan recognized the subtle psychological implications. The painting had the power to unsettle not only her perception of time, but her understanding of reality itself. Could Walter have created this, directly or indirectly, as a form of communication? Or was this the work of another, someone who had observed him or tapped into details of his life with uncanny precision? The questions multiplied, each one carrying emotional weight and forensic significance. The scene depicted in oil or acrylic was static, yet it implied movement and presence, a continuity that the physical world had denied her for years. Susan felt a shiver of recognition for the broader implications. If this was possible, if a missing person could manifest in such a concrete form through art, then everything she thought she knew about disappearance, absence, and the boundaries of life and observation was suddenly fragile and provisional. As she reluctantly tore her gaze away, A subtle determination began to emerge. This was no longer a passive waiting game. The painting had shifted the narrative from the ordinary to the uncanny, from unresolved disappearance to an eerie, intricate form of contact. Susan understood, with a mixture of fear and clarity, that the next steps would involve both careful observation and a willingness to confront realities she had long avoided. She needed to trace the provenance of the painting, speak to anyone connected to its creation, and reconcile the surreal with the tangible. The emotional shock merged with investigative impulse, each reinforcing the other. In that gallery, surrounded by the quiet hum of other visitors and the sterile light of display, Susan Green realized that Walter's story was not concluded, that his presence had returned in a form that defied explanation, and that the journey toward understanding was only just beginning. The painting hung as a silent sentinel, bridging absence and presence, grief and revelation, leaving the story poised on the edge of a discovery that promised to reshape everything the family had known about loss and hope. After the shock of seeing Walter's likeness on the gallery wall, Susan Green felt a surge of determination that pushed past the lingering disbelief. She knew that if there was any hope of understanding the painting, she could not do it alone. The following morning, she contacted the local police department, providing photographs she had taken of the painting and recounting her emotional reaction. Detectives who had worked on Walter's disappearance years earlier listened with polite skepticism, though some noted the uncanny specificity of her account. They agreed to reopen the case in a narrow, targeted sense, focusing not on Walter's disappearance directly, but on the origin of the artwork itself. Susan also reached out to investigative journalists, hoping that a wider lens might uncover details beyond the immediate circle of law enforcement. For her, every lead was vital, every question an anchor against the unrelenting void of 4 years without her father. The gallery staff were initially hesitant, reluctant to reveal the artist's identity to anyone beyond casual inquiries. After several weeks of negotiation, however, they confirmed that the painting was created by a reclusive man named Henry Lawson, a resident who had lived in the outskirts of town for years but maintained minimal social contact. Lawson was known in fragments, a quiet man who rarely attended community events, kept to himself, and whose few previous works consisted mainly of landscapes and abstract studies. There was no indication that he had ever attempted realistic portraits before, let alone one with such intimate familiarity to a specific family. This revelation both alarmed and intrigued Susan, as the possibility that a stranger could replicate her father's image with such precision seemed improbable, almost impossible. Yet here it was, a concrete clue linking the artwork to a tangible individual, someone who could, in theory, explain the painting or at least offer insight into its creation. Police investigators began canvassing the neighborhood surrounding Lawson's residence, speaking to neighbors who had seen him over the years. Stories were consistent in portraying him as solitary, meticulous, and enigmatic. Some recalled seeing him carrying large canvases or unusual supplies, but could not confirm what he was working on. One neighbor remembered glimpsing a series of oddly shaped canvases leaning against his garage, covered in cloth, their purpose unknown. No one reported witnessing visits from anyone resembling Walter or any unusual interactions, which only deepened the mystery. The detective in charge noted that while Lawson's existence and routine were easily documented, the specifics of his artistic process were a blank. How could a man with no prior interest in portraits, no apparent connection to Walter, create a depiction that resonated so perfectly with the Green family's memories? Journalists investigating Lawson's background uncovered additional anomalies. Local records indicated that he had acquired a set of canvases, paints, and brushes within the last 6 months, an investment unusually large for someone whose previous work had been modest and mostly experimental. Interviews with older residents suggested that Lawson had previously lived in isolation for decades, emerging only sporadically to sell small pieces at minor exhibitions. The sudden appearance of a realistic portrait, rendered with uncanny fidelity, challenged every assumption about his previous artistic boundaries. Some speculated that Lawson might have observed Walter secretly, perhaps through windows or photographs, while others considered less plausible ideas that Lawson had somehow tapped into a psychic or spiritual connection. The line between rational explanation and eerie possibility began to blur, leaving the community and Susan herself in a state of tense uncertainty. The Green family, already conditioned by years of absence, felt the weight of this revelation acutely. Susan, driven by both hope and obsession, pressed investigators for access to Lawson, seeking a direct explanation. Her mother, cautiously supportive, warned her against expecting closure too soon, fearing further emotional upheaval. Yet Susan persisted, documenting every interaction, every recollection from neighbors and journalists, determined to trace the path from the painting to the reality of her father's fate. She combed through Lawson's past works, analyzing brushstrokes, compositional choices, and recurring motifs for hidden clues. Each detail, no matter how minute, carried the possibility of unraveling the mystery that had consumed her life for 4 years. Her diligence reflected both the intensity of grief and a growing awareness that the painting was a signal, an entry point into the unknown, a thread that might lead to the answers she had long sought. As inquiries progressed, skepticism and fascination intertwined. Investigators questioned whether the painting was evidence of Walter's presence, a figment of artistic imagination, or something else entirely beyond comprehension. The community, having largely moved on from the disappearance, began whispering about the bizarre convergence of art and absence. Theories circulated. Some suggested Walter had been hiding, intentionally leaving traces. Others wondered if the painting depicted him posthumously, through memory or imagination. A few considered that Lawson's talent somehow captured a lifelike essence without explanation. No theory could be confirmed, and yet each possibility heightened the tension, reinforcing the story's slow-burning sense of unease. Susan felt the emotional gravity of this period acutely, oscillating between hope that her father was alive and terror at the implications of the inexplicable. By the end of 2023, the investigation into Lawson and the painting had created a network of observation, interviews, and speculation that stretched across both legal and informal channels. Every lead carried emotional resonance, every discovery both illuminating and disorienting. The narrative had shifted from a cold case defined by absence to a living enigma, where art, memory, and potential supernatural or extraordinary explanation converged. Susan's dedication became both a personal coping mechanism and a driving force for the community to reconsider what they thought they knew about Walter's disappearance. With Lawson identified, but still enigmatic, the stage was set for further revelations, each layer peeling back more questions than answers. The story teetered between the ordinary and the extraordinary, leaving an unresolved tension that demanded pursuit, a continuation that promised insight, confrontation, and potentially closure. Investigators finally gained access to Henry Lawson's studio after weeks of legal clearance and careful negotiation. What they found was a meticulous, almost obsessive record of observation, documenting years they had assumed had been lost to silence. The room smelled faintly of turpentine and aged paper, and every wall was lined with canvases in various stages of completion, some abstract, others painfully precise. On a large work table lay neatly organized folders containing photographs, sketches, and handwritten journals. At first glance, the materials seemed disjointed, a random collection of artistic experiments, but as detectives began to cross-reference dates and notes, a pattern emerged, one that slowly reframed the timeline of Walter Green's disappearance. The realization came with both awe and unease. Lawson had been watching, observing Walter in a way that went far beyond casual inspiration. Each photograph, each sketch, documented moments Walter's family had long presumed lost to the void of 4 silent years. The photographs were taken from afar, using angles that suggested Lawson had stationed himself strategically to avoid detection. Some images captured Walter in mundane daily routines, sitting on his porch in the late afternoon, tending to small garden tasks, gazing toward the street, but the passage of time was apparent in the subtle changes of light, clothing, and season. The sketches often mirrored these photographs, rendered with a level of detail that suggested intense focus, a desire to capture not just appearance, but essence. The journals revealed Lawson's thoughts in careful, disciplined entries. He wrote of patterns he noticed in Walter's behavior, the rhythm of his movements, the small gestures that made him recognizable. Occasionally, the entries veered into philosophical reflection, questioning the nature of observation, the act of capturing life on canvas, and the fleeting permanence of memory. There was no indication of malice, yet the sheer intimacy of the documentation felt intrusive, bordering on obsession. Cross-referencing the timestamps on photographs, the detectives discovered a startling anomaly. One particular series depicted Walter sitting on his porch under the oak tree, the exact location later immortalized in the unsigned gallery painting. The dates of these images were months after his disappearance, suggesting that Walter had somehow survived, remained unseen by neighbors, yet continued to exist in a private orbit. The painting in the gallery was not a depiction of memory, nor an imagined reconstruction. It was a reproduction of a lived moment, witnessed and chronicled by Lawson without the knowledge of the Green family or the wider community. The implication was profound. Walter had not vanished in the immediate final sense previously assumed. For years he had been alive, living in a state of hidden existence, captured by the lens of another man's relentless observation. Detectives began to piece together Lawson's methodology. Notes indicated careful timing, long observation periods, and an intentional avoidance of interaction. Lawson's entries described the technical aspects of surveillance: light, shadow, angle, distance, yet he also recorded subtle emotional impressions, his fascination with Walter's composure and quiet demeanor. There was a sense of reverence threaded through the documentation, an almost obsessive dedication to capturing an unaltered truth. It became clear that the painting Susan had seen at the gallery was not an isolated work but the culmination of months of discreet observation, synthesized into a final, strikingly realistic portrait. This revelation heightened the emotional stakes for Susan and her family, who had imagined the worst for 4 years, only to realize that the timeline of her father's existence had continued in parallel, hidden from view. The narrative carefully unfolded in the investigators' reports, each detail threaded into a chronology that slowly revealed the convergence of surveillance, artistic obsession, and the hidden life of Walter Green. Law enforcement now faced the delicate challenge of contextualizing these findings to a family whose grief had been defined by absence. Susan pored over the materials herself under supervision, experiencing waves of relief, confusion, and guilt. Her father had existed all along, yet invisible, unapproachable, and quietly documented. The photographs and sketches created a new dimension of understanding, a visual record that had preserved him in ways her memory could not. The juxtaposition of observation and emotional distance, of art and reality, created a complex psychological landscape, one where hope and shock intertwined and closure remained tantalizingly incomplete. Throughout the community, awareness of the findings triggered renewed conversation and speculation. Neighbors revisited their own recollections, questioning if they had glimpsed Walter during the intervening years without realizing it. Lawson, previously enigmatic, emerged as a central figure, a silent chronicler whose motives and ethical boundaries became subjects of intense discussion. Some saw his work as an extension of archival diligence, preserving life that might otherwise have been forgotten. Others questioned the moral implications, suggesting that such surveillance without consent straddled a line between fascination and intrusion. The story expanded beyond the Green household, illustrating how disappearance, observation, and art could converge to create a narrative that was both emotionally gripping and psychologically complex. As detectives cataloged the material and reconstructed the timeline, the contours of Walter's hidden existence became increasingly tangible. Each timestamp, each sketch, each written note added a layer to a story previously defined by mystery and absence. Susan and the investigators began to form a mosaic from fragments, realizing that the painting, the photographs, and the journals were all threads in a larger tapestry. The timeline revealed not only survival, but the haunting reality of observation. Walter's life had continued quietly, documented by another's relentless eye until the artwork eventually surfaced, bridging the gap between private existence and public awareness. The story, slow-burning and immersive, had shifted from the terror of disappearance to the uncanny tension of being seen yet unseen, alive yet hidden, and poised the narrative for the eventual revelation that would bring the mystery toward its conclusive, haunting resolution. Authorities approached Henry Lawson's secluded property with a mixture of caution and anticipation. The house, hidden by overgrown hedges and the surrounding forest, had always contributed to the air of mystery that enveloped Lawson. When the door finally opened, Lawson appeared guarded but not hostile, his eyes betraying the weight of years spent in solitude and observation. Detectives presented him with the mounting evidence, the photographs, sketches, journals, and the painting that had first drawn Susan's attention, requesting clarity. At first, Lawson remained silent, his hands fidgeting with the edge of a worn canvas, and for a tense moment, the room seemed suspended in uncertainty. Then, slowly, he began to speak, his voice low but deliberate, carrying a quiet gravity that immediately set the emotional tone for the revelation to come. Lawson recounted how Walter Green had wandered onto his property in the autumn of 2019, disoriented and visibly struggling with the early stages of dementia. The man who had vanished from public life was not a victim of foul play, nor had he been abducted. He had sought refuge in isolation, overwhelmed by the weight of expectations, concern from loved ones, and the unrelenting scrutiny of a world that had already begun to forget him. Lawson, who lived a deliberately reclusive life, offered shelter, providing food, warmth, and a quiet space where Walter could exist without interference. Walter had accepted, understanding that distance from familiar routines and family interactions might prolong his autonomy, allowing him to live on his own terms, however limited by illness. Lawson's words were precise, factual, and devoid of dramatization, yet the emotional resonance was unmistakable. A father who disappeared not out of malice or fear, but from a profound human need for control over the final chapters of his life. The narrative Lawson unfolded revealed a delicate, patient relationship between the two men. Walter, aware of his memory lapses and the gradual erosion of his faculties, engaged with Lawson in conversation, sometimes lucid, sometimes confused, and gradually settled into a rhythm that suited his condition. Lawson, in turn, documented Walter's presence through sketches, photographs, and eventually paintings, capturing moments that might otherwise have been lost to the inexorable progression of dementia. These works were not created for profit or notoriety, but as a visual chronicle, a meticulous record of a life that had withdrawn from public view. Each brushstroke, each pencil line, each carefully timed photograph was a testament to observation and care, chronicling decline without judgment, documenting solitude without intrusion. The gallery painting that had shocked Susan was a culmination of these efforts, a singular, poignant depiction of Walter on the porch beneath the oak tree, alive yet unseen. Detectives noted the timeline Lawson provided, confirming that Walter had remained on the property consistently from 2019 until shortly before the painting's public appearance. During this period, Walter had been largely self-sufficient, with Lawson offering assistance only when necessary. Letters found in Lawson's journals referenced subtle interactions, water delivered to the porch, meals arranged discreetly, and conversations about small, everyday matters, emphasizing dignity and privacy. There was no evidence of coercion or fear. Rather, Walter's choice to isolate reflected a complex negotiation with his declining cognitive state, the psychological burden of his condition, and his desire to remain autonomous. Lawson's documentation, though meticulous, had a profound sensitivity. It captured Walter's presence without exploiting his vulnerability, creating an ethical paradox that challenged investigators to reconcile secrecy with compassion. The emotional impact on Susan was immediate and visceral. She absorbed Lawson's account alongside the visual records he had maintained, confronting the reality that her father had lived, unobserved by the world, coping with illness and choosing solitude. Relief, sorrow, and a measure of guilt intertwined as she reviewed sketches and photographs of her father, images that confirmed life and agency, yet underscored the distance imposed by his self-imposed exile. Investigators noted the intensity of this familial confrontation, understanding that the psychological realism extended beyond Walter himself to the ripple effects on his loved ones, 4 years of grief, unanswered questions, and the profound tension of uncertainty, now reframed by understanding rather than fear. Lawson explained that Walter's decision was not permanent in a rigid sense, it was contingent, a strategy to manage the progression of dementia in a context free from judgment or interference. The narrative emphasized nuance. Walter's vanishing was self-imposed, non-malicious, and carefully orchestrated to protect both himself and his daughter from the painful realities of decline. Investigators recognized the delicate intersection of autonomy, illness, and secrecy, framing the case not as a criminal mystery, but as a psychological study in choice, care, and observation. For Susan, the revelation resolved the fundamental question of what had happened to her father, while simultaneously confronting her with the complexities of human frailty, love, and the lengths to which one might go to preserve dignity. By the conclusion of the interview, the room carried a somber, reflective stillness. Lawson's final words conveyed neither triumph nor apology, only explanation, emphasizing the quiet, enduring reality of a life lived in parallel to the world's perception. Walter Green had disappeared from public view, yet his existence had continued in measured, intentional isolation, documented by a man who understood the fragility of memory and the importance of preservation. The narrative, long defined by absence and fear, now shifted toward comprehension and reconciliation, transforming years of speculation and heartache into a portrait of survival, choice, and the human desire for autonomy. In the slow-burning cadence of investigation, documentation, and emotional truth, the story of Walter Green reached its definitive revelation. A disappearance dictated not by violence or malice, but by illness, agency, and the quiet, unacknowledged acts of care that sustained him through years of unseen life. The final revelation arrived quietly, without fanfare, yet it carried the weight of years of unanswered questions. Walter Green, the man whose disappearance had consumed his family and puzzled the town, had not vanished into some dark fate or been taken against his will. For years he had lived in deliberate seclusion on the property of Henry Lawson, shielded from the world by both his choice and the care of the reclusive artist. Walter's life after 2019 was a hidden continuum, lived day by day in the measured rhythms of solitude, a life documented carefully through sketches, photographs, and paintings that captured the slow, inexorable effects of early-stage dementia. These records, once mysterious artifacts, now formed the evidence of a life quietly endured, a reality that reconciled fear with understanding. Susan Green, confronted with the truth, experienced a turbulence of emotions, relief, sorrow, grief, and an unexpected sense of closure. The father she had feared lost forever had lived, had continued to exist beyond the reach of concern and speculation, and had ultimately passed peacefully in late 2023. Lawson's meticulous documentation offered a final testimony. The painting that had so shocked gallery visitors was not an uncanny apparition, but a deliberate, intimate record of Walter's presence beneath the oak tree, a moment frozen in time that bridged absence and memory. It was an artistic acknowledgement of life, a witness to both the fragility and persistence of human existence. Investigators, journalists, and neighbors who had followed the case reflected on the profound implications of the revelation. A disappearance that had once provoked fear, confusion, and wild speculation now transformed into a narrative about autonomy, illness, and compassion. Walter's choice to isolate himself was framed not by secrecy or malice, but by the human instinct to preserve dignity when confronted by the slow erosion of mind and memory. Lawson's role, initially opaque and puzzling, was clarified as one of quiet guardianship, an observer and protector who ensured Walter's existence remained intact, documented without exploitation, shielded without interference. For Susan, reconciliation involved more than understanding the logistics of her father's absence. It required facing the paradox of his decision that he had disappeared to safeguard himself and, paradoxically, his daughter from the painful realities of cognitive decline. Accepting this truth allowed her to move beyond years of hypervigilance, obsessive searching, and the gnawing uncertainty that had characterized her life since 2019. The images, the sketches, and the painting now served as tangible links to her father's final years, proof of survival, proof of choice, and proof of a life quietly observed. As the story concluded, the broader reflections settled over those who had followed the mystery. Walter Green's life, once shrouded in fear and speculation, illuminated the delicate intersections between isolation, memory, and human compassion. The narrative was no longer a tale of abduction or disappearance, but a study in dignity, the ethics of care, and the quiet, often invisible ways in which people navigate the limits of mind, body, and circumstance. In the end, the mystery resolved not with shock or tragedy, but with understanding, honoring both Walter's autonomy and the deep, enduring bond between father and daughter. A resolution as emotionally grounded as it was factually complete.